More recently, there was, thankfully, there was a backlash from the people. And the people dissented, and this wasn't just progressives. So these were conservative states, progressive states, northern, southern, eastern, western. And there was a division in terms of why the dissent and the backlash started happening. On the one hand, progressives were concerned. They saw that the military equipment was disproportionately used on marginalized communities, on people of color, on protesters, civil disobedience. And they believed that, and were able to prove in court case after court case, that civil rights violations were occurring. But even conservatives, they were disturbed by the amassing of military equipment, because even though it came free to towns and cities and tiny little hamlets, they found that very quickly community budgets were getting overburdened by the maintenance for such equipment. And then as they caught the bug to acquire more of it through commercial channels, they literally just started overspending. And so even conservatives said, hey, why is our city spending millions of dollars on military equipment when we don't really have a crime problem? So partisan, if you will, backlash started to mobilize some legislative efforts to curtail the disbursement of military equipment to the public and to agencies, meaning cities and law enforcement entities. In 2015, Obama signed an executive order. By the way, legislative efforts tended to fail because things were divided, and because of the situations we understand now in terms of Senate control at the federal level, it was very difficult to get these kinds of legislations changed to limit disbursement. So presidents started relying on the executive orders. So in 2015, Obama issued an executive order to try to limit this Section 1033 disbursement to prohibit certain items, certain very violent and large items. And then, of course, when Trump came in, he removed all those constraints, and he, in fact, expanded the program. And meanwhile, in California, there were actual legislative efforts to nullify 1033, to literally eliminate it. And so while those efforts have waxed and waned and continued to this day, none have been successful in nullifying 1033. Now, in May of 2022, President Biden issued another executive order, and it was called Advancing Effective, Accountable Policing and Criminal Justice Practices to Enhance Public Trust and Public Safety. The focus being on public safety versus on arming law enforcement. It did not nullify 1033, again, prohibited certain military equipment from being dispersed, and it added the threshold, it increased the threshold of certification, if you will, for other military equipment to require higher justification for its use and need. And then it imposed its authority on all federal agencies transferring military equipment to civil agencies, because it turned out that while these acts, the National Defense Act was the main means, and what they call the 1033 program was the main means of disbursement, the Department of Homeland Security was this sidestep around. They also gained authority to disperse military equipment, and so some agencies would bypass 1033 and go directly to the Department of Homeland Security. So Biden's executive order put that all under an umbrella in terms of you have to all conform, regardless of the route by which you get military equipment, you have to conform to these requirements. Suffice to say, however, that the instability of federal management of military equipment policy, because it seems to be waxing and waning with whoever's in office, what this really calls to action is that military equipment control has to happen at a local level. And that's why states and cities and counties need to really take responsibility for how military equipment is used in their regions. And as a result, it's very important when you see a military equipment use policy come to your community, it's important that the public really understand what's going on and really set the expectations for behavior that its police department and the city council or governing body that oversees them, how they military equipment use policy. So what is military equipment? AB 481 very specifically lists all the things they consider military equipment. This graphic here is just a visual to show you some things. On the upper left-hand picture is a picture of what we call a tank, but what AB 481 calls a tracked vehicle. And that's because it doesn't go on wheels, it goes on tracks. At the very top picture, that orange and black thing is a shotgun, but intended to launch projectiles such as batons, or, and a baton is not something you hit somebody with. In this case, the baton looks like a long pill, but it's hard coated, and it may contain lead shot, or it may contain a spongy material. They're considered less lethal projectiles. That includes beanbags as well that are filled with lead shot. Now I want to qualify what less lethal means. In the old days, they called them non-lethal, but studies showed that unless the target area, and there are only two target areas on a human being where less lethal munitions are to be targeted in, that is the thigh and the buttocks, because studies showed, and in world experiences showed, that if you hit somebody in the eye, in the head, in the throat, in the chest, and in the spine, you can kill them. And therefore, they cannot call it non-lethal, they call it less lethal. And it requires skill in order to aim properly, as you can imagine. At upper right are militarized drones with surveillance capabilities, sometimes weapons, sometimes not. In the middle, right, the top, the second from the top in the middle are examples of these batons. The one that's yellow and blue has a sponge tip, the other ones are harder. On the second from the top on the right is a shotgun. The vehicle second from the top on the left is called an MEUP, for mine resistant, ambush protected vehicle. Basically, it protects against explosive ordnance going at it, but not as well as a tank, but still. And it is shocking how many towns, even tiny little towns, have invested in MEUPs. In the third from the top is the two officers at the left are holding off to the right what's called a munitions pole. And a munitions pole delivers diversionary or explosive materials or chemical munitions into an area, and that extension of the pole allows the officers to not be in the direct fire. But as you can see in this picture here, they're delivering what's called a flashbang, which is a very loud and bright explosive munition that they throw into the window in order to suppress the suspects inside. And when I say explosive in the case of a flashbang doesn't have shrapnel, but it does explode, as you can see. And its coating, instead of creating shrapnel, it explodes into powder. Nevertheless, you can see how it can be dangerous. If somebody's face was near that, it would probably burn them very badly. Down in the lower left, you can see the sponge batons, as I showed before, but also in those black canisters, those are chemical. They could be pepper oriented, or they can be tear gas. And lower right are all sorts of automatic and semi-automatic weapons. The other thing to keep in mind is that the government classifies military equipment that is used to train people to use military equipment, also military equipment. And the other thing is that a piece of equipment does not have to come from the military if it's on this list. You can get all of the things, all the less lethal projectiles, the munitions pole, the shotgun, the semi-automatic and automatic weapons, and many drones. You can get everything on here except for the tracked vehicle. Actually, you can get an MEUP commercially. So the only thing on here that you cannot get commercially is a tracked vehicle. Everything else on here you can get through commercial retail channels. And as a result, the AB 481 covers both equipment that comes from the federal government, as well as equipment that is acquired commercially. So what is AB 481? What does it aim to do? Let's focus on the little graphic. In the circle there, you see the funding, the acquisition, and the use of military equipment. That's very simple to understand. How do you pay for it? What do you want to buy? How are you authorized to use it? How do you get trained to use it? And in fact, our current policy, 709, which is our Los Altos policy, it pretty much does that. I would say I would give it, maybe if 100% means it does the entire job, it probably gets a good 80% grade, which is like a B minus. But what AB 481 aims to do is much more than that, and that it also wraps around the task of taking an inventory and making sure you're trained to know how to use this equipment, in that it creates a very transparent program that any member of the public should be able to understand. It also makes sure that the process of deciding what the law enforcement agency wants to buy is transparent as well. It also requires accountability and independent oversight. And what that means is that even if the city council and thereby the public approves the funding and acquisition and use of the military equipment, it's an ongoing process to make sure that it continues to be valid. And so there are reviews required, and there are personnel that have to be, in charge of that. And if something goes wrong, that person or that entity or that group, they have to take responsibility. And finally, which leads you to the fact that should anything ever be done that's not in accordance with the law or in accordance with the policy, there have to be consequences. So this is the public comes into play in all three of these areas, in the sense that is why these attributes exist in the law. It's not enough to create an inventory list. You have to create a process around that and a justification around that, and a means by which rules breakers meet their match. They suffer the consequences of not following the rules. It also gives the people the right, and they always have the right. They have what's called agency to apply constraints on the use of military equipment even beyond the terms that AB 481 requires. So say, for example, in a very extreme example, AB 481 says, here are the kinds of things that are military equipment. And an agency, a law enforcement agency may say, here are the kinds of military equipment that we have here in this particular agency. The people have the right to say, we don't want any of it. And if they choose to do that, and their city council approves that, then that's what will happen. So that's the level of law. I'm not saying that that's what we're fighting for, we're not, but it just shows you that this is a law of by and for the people, and they have that agency in terms of applying the constraints that they wish on the use of military equipment. So more specifically, now let's go to the left side here. More specifically, AB 481 aims to do these things. It does acknowledge the fact that 1033, the Federal Disbursement Authority, does exist. It does. It also, this is where I really love the way they crafted this. It reckons with the troubled history of the inequitable use of military equipment in marginalized communities. Well, anytime I use quotes here, I am quoting from the Act. It doesn't shy away from that fact. It also affirms that the deployment of military equipment adversely impacts the public safety and welfare. In and of itself, weapons of war are dangerous, and they're more dangerous than regular weapons. And they also give a different kind of image and a different kind of impression on the public. So the starting assumption is there's an adverse impact, and it's up to the way you implement your military equipment use policy to calm that negative impact and to make the public feel safe and not in danger. Next, it specifies the standards by which military equipment is defined and justified and deployed through an ongoing process, and that is very key, not a one-time process, an ongoing living process. And it affirms the people's right to understand it, to assess it, approve it, limit it, reject it, and appeal the use of military equipment that may have been approved before, and now they've changed their mind.